I want to tell you about the day my son looked me in the eye and told me I was embarrassing him. Not in private. Not in a whispered argument after dinner. He said it in front of 30 people, in the dining room of a house I had helped pay for, at a table I had never once been invited to sit at. His name is my son Caleb, and I am his mother. I am 63 years old. I taught 4th grade for 27 years, and I sold the only home I ever owned to help him build something he said would change our lives. He was right about that. It did change our lives, just not the way either of us expected. Let me start at the beginning, because you need to understand what we were, before all of this happened. Before the money, and the company, and the wife and the father-in-law who decided I wasn't good enough to be in the same room as him. Caleb was 12 when his father left. No warning, no long conversation at the kitchen table, nothing like that. One Tuesday morning, Dennis drove to work and simply never came back. He called 3 days later from a number I didn't recognize, told me he had been unhappy for years, and asked me to please mail him his baseball card collection when I had a moment. That was it. I sat on the floor of the hallway for about 20 minutes after I hung up. Then I got up, washed my face, drove to Caleb's school, picked him up, took him to Dairy Queen, and told him that from now on it was just the two of us. He ate his blizzard without saying anything for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "Okay, Mom, we'll be fine." He was 12 years old and he was trying to take care of me. We were fine. It wasn't easy, but we were fine. I worked summers tutoring. I took on a second job grading standardized tests on weekends. I packed Caleb's lunch every single day until he graduated high school, because the school cafeteria was $4 a day, and $4 a day adds up. We didn't take vacations. We didn't have cable. When my car needed a new transmission, I cried for exactly one evening, and then called 3 different mechanics, until I found one who would let me pay in installments. Caleb was a good kid. He was serious and hardworking, and a little too old for his age, the way kids get when they've seen a parent struggle. He got a partial scholarship to the state university, worked part-time his entire 4 years, graduated with a degree in computer science, and came home the summer after graduation with a notebook full of ideas for a software platform he wanted to build. I didn't understand most of what he told me about it. Something to do with streamlining logistics for small warehouses, making it easier for smaller companies to manage inventory the way big companies did. He sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours explaining it, drawing diagrams on a legal pad, and what I understood was this. My son had a dream. He had a plan. He had worked out the numbers carefully. He needed startup capital, around $40,000, to get the first version built and licensed. I had $52,000 in savings. It had taken me 19 years to save it. I gave him $40,000 without hesitating, he cried. I hadn't seen him cry since he was 14, he said. "Mom, I'm going to pay you back every cent. I'm going to pay you back double." I told him I wasn't doing it for the money. I was doing it because I believed in him. What I did not do, and I want to be honest about this because it matters later, what I did not do was have a lawyer draw up any paperwork. We didn't sign anything. I transferred the money. He opened a business account, and we shook hands across the kitchen table like the two of us used to do when he was little, and we made an agreement about chores or bedtime. That was our way. That was always our way. I trusted my son completely. He named the company Bridgepoint Solutions. For the first 2 years, it was just Caleb working 18-hour days in a rented office space the size of a large closet. I drove over on Sundays sometimes with a pan of lasagna or a container of soup. He looked exhausted but alive in a way I hadn't seen before. Lit up from the inside, like a person doing exactly what they were meant to do. The platform got its first real client in the 2nd year. Then 3 more. Then word spread. And that's when Caleb met Daphne Holbrook. She was the daughter of a client. Her father, Reginald Holbrook, ran a mid-sized distribution company out of Columbus, Ohio, and when Caleb flew out to sign the contract, Daphne was at the office that day, helping her father with something unrelated. They had dinner, then another dinner. 6 months later, Caleb called to tell me they were serious. I was happy for him. I want to be clear about that. In the beginning, I was genuinely happy. Daphne seemed bright and confident, and she laughed easily. When Caleb brought her home to meet me, she shook my hand firmly and said she had heard so much about me and was so glad to finally meet the woman who had raised someone like Caleb. I liked her. I thought we would become close over time. What I didn't understand yet was Reginald Holbrook. Reginald was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately reorganized it around himself. Not loudly, that's the thing. He was always perfectly pleasant, always smiling. He called me Margaret from the very first meeting, even though I hadn't introduced myself that way. And there was something in the way he said it, just a half degree off from warm. That made me feel I was being filed somewhere under a category I hadn't agreed to. He had the kind of wealth that had been in the family long enough to feel like a personality trait. The house in Columbus was enormous and aggressively beautiful. He dressed the way men dress when they stopped having to think about money 30 years ago. And he had opinions. Constant, quiet, confident opinions about everything, including about Bridgepoint Solutions. Within a year of Caleb and Daphne becoming serious, Reginald had inserted himself into the business in ways I was only beginning to understand. He introduced Caleb to investors. He advised on contracts. He suggested Caleb needed a board. He offered to bring in a business attorney he trusted, a man named Hugh Garrett, to help Caleb restructure the company for its next phase of growth. Caleb was grateful, of course he was. He was 27, and he had built something real, but he had never navigated serious investment before. Having someone like Reginald guiding him must have felt like a gift. I didn't say anything. Not at first. It wasn't my place to tell my son that something felt off when I couldn't point to anything specific. I just watched. I kept my Sunday visits. I kept making the lasagna, and I told myself I was being territorial, that I was struggling to share my son with another family, the way mothers do when children grow up and form new attachments. Caleb proposed to Daphne the following spring. Beautiful ceremony in June, outside at the Holbrook estate. I wore the blue dress I had bought for my school's retirement gala, and I sat in the front row and I cried during the vows. Reginald sat beside his wife, Cornelia, and he smiled at everything and he shook my hand at the reception and said, "Well, we're family now, Margaret." And I smiled back and said, "Yes, I suppose we are." And then things began to change. It started slowly, the way these things always do. Caleb called less often. When I called him, he was frequently busy, distracted, apologetic in a distant sort of way. The Sunday visits stopped. First, they became irregular, then they stopped entirely. When I asked why, he said the company was going through a growth phase, and he barely had time to breathe. I understood that. I tried to understand that. But then I started noticing other things. A company newsletter. Bridgepoint had started sending one to clients and partners. Came to my email address because I was listed as an early stakeholder. One quarter I opened it and read a section about the company's founding story. It talked about Caleb's vision, his years building the platform, Reginald's early mentorship. There was no mention of where the original funding had come from. No mention of me at all. I told myself it was an oversight. The following Christmas, Caleb and Daphne hosted dinner at their new house. A house in a suburb of Columbus, beautiful, large. Nothing like the apartment Caleb had lived in when we shook hands across my kitchen table. Reginald and Cornelia were there, several of their friends. I drove 4 hours to be there. I brought a pie I had made from scratch and a card I had spent 40 minutes picking out. I was seated at the far end of the table. Reginald sat at the head, naturally. He told stories, he made toasts. He talked about Daphne's childhood, and about the Holbrook family history, and about how proud he was of what Caleb had built with the right guidance and support. He did not look at me when he said it. After dinner, when I was helping clear the table, because that is what I do, because I cannot sit still while there is work to be done. Daphne came to stand beside me at the kitchen sink and said, very quietly and very pleasantly, "You know, Margaret, you don't have to do that. The caterers will handle it." There were caterers. I hadn't realized. I set down the plate I was holding and dried my hands on a dish towel and went back to the dining room. Caleb did not say anything to me for the rest of the evening. I drove home that night alone, 4 hours in the dark, and I thought about the girl Caleb used to be as a boy. Not a girl, a boy. I know, but I mean the softness of him, the way he used to fall asleep against my shoulder watching movies. The way he used to come into my room during thunderstorms, even at 10 and 11 years old, and I would lift the covers and he would climb in without saying a word. I thought about all of it, and I thought, something is happening to my son. Something is being done to him, or something is happening in him, and I don't know how to stop it. The moment I knew for certain came 6 months before the day I told you about at the beginning, the day he said I embarrassed him. I had called Caleb to tell him I was thinking about selling my house. My house, the smaller one I had bought after selling the original one to give him the $40,000, needed a new roof. The estimate was $18,000. I was on a teacher's pension. I was asking, gently, carefully, in the way you ask your child for help when you've spent your entire life being the one who gives, whether there was any possibility of a small loan. 10,000. Whatever he could manage. There was a long silence. Then Caleb said, "Mom, the company's finances are really complicated right now. We're in the middle of a restructuring. I don't think I can move that kind of money personally without it looking strange." I said I understood. He said he would look into it. He never called back about it. I had the roof repaired with money from my retirement account. I paid the penalty for early withdrawal. I did not tell Caleb. What I did instead was call my old friend Loretta, who had been a paralegal for 20 years before she retired, and I told her everything over the phone one afternoon. While I sat on my porch watching the birds at the feeder I'd had since Caleb was small, Loretta listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Honey, do you still have any paperwork from when you gave Caleb that money?" I told her we had never done any paperwork. We had shaken hands. She said, "Do you have your bank records, the transfer?" I did. I never throw away financial records. 27 years of teaching with a budget tighter than most people's vacation spending will do that to you, she said. Good. Hang on to everything. And do me a favor. Look up a man named Alan Whitfield. He's a business and estate attorney. He does initial consultations for free. I think you should talk to him. I wrote the name down. I did not call Alan Whitfield right away. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself there was still time to talk to Caleb. That if I just got him alone, away from the Holbrooks, away from Reginald, and Hugh Garrett, and all of the careful restructuring, I could reach him. I could remind him of who we were to each other. I could remind him of the kitchen table. That conversation never happened. Instead, what happened was the shareholder dinner. Bridgepoint Solutions had grown to the point where Reginald and his attorney had formalized the company structure significantly. There were now official investors, an advisory board, and quarterly shareholder dinners that Caleb described to me once, briefly, as mostly just social events with some business talk. He mentioned I was still technically listed as an early investor. He said it in the way you mention something administrative like a footnote. I received an invitation to one of these dinners. I assumed it was routine. I drove to Columbus, checked into a modest hotel, put on my best outfit, and arrived at the venue. A private dining room at a hotel far nicer than mine. Feeling, I will admit, nervous. Like I was entering a place I had been allowed into but not entirely welcomed. Reginald was there when I arrived. He smiled and shook my hand and said, "Well, Margaret, we weren't sure you'd make it," which I understood was not a welcome. There were perhaps 30 people in the room. Investors, advisors, a few of Daphne's family friends who had put money in. I knew no one. I found my place card. I was near the far end again. And I sat down and I smiled at the people around me and I waited. Halfway through the first course, Reginald stood up to give remarks. He talked about the company's growth. He talked about the restructuring. He thanked the partners who had believed in the vision from the early days. And he gestured around the room at the investors with their tailored suits and their confident postures. And then he said something that made me set down my fork. He said the company had undergone a full equity review and that all early informal arrangements had been properly documented and formalized. He said he was proud that Bridgepoint now had a clean, professional ownership structure worthy of the next stage of growth. I knew what that meant. I just didn't know yet exactly how it had been done. I looked down the table at Caleb. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his plate. After the remarks, during the dessert course, I walked to where Caleb was sitting. I put my hand on his shoulder gently, the way I had when he was a boy, and I wanted to get his attention without startling him. I said quietly, "Caleb, I'd like to talk to you. Can we step outside for just a few minutes?" He looked up at me and I saw something on his face that I had not seen before. Not guilt, exactly. Something colder than guilt, something that had been worked on. He said, "Mom, can this wait? I'm kind of in the middle of things." I said, "It's important," he said. "Everything feels important to you." The people around us had gone quiet in that particular way. People go quiet when they are pretending not to hear something. I felt the heat in my face. I said, "Caleb." And then he said it. He said, "Mom, honestly? You make everything harder than it needs to be. You don't understand how business works. You've never understood it. I love you, but you're embarrassing." The room was not silent. There was still the low sound of other conversations, the clink of silverware, but the table near us was very quiet. I looked at my son. He was wearing a suit I had never seen before, in a room I had driven 4 hours to be in, surrounded by people who had been strategically placed around him to make him into something I didn't fully recognize. And he was looking at me with an expression that was patient and a little tired. The way you look at someone you have decided is a problem to be managed. I picked up my purse. I said, "All right, Caleb." And I walked out of the room. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a while. I didn't cry. I was past crying, I think. I was in that particular kind of stillness that comes after something breaks. Not the breaking itself, but the moment after, when you look at the pieces and you understand that something has to happen now. That you cannot simply keep going the way you have been going. I drove back to my hotel. I ordered room service, which I never do because it's expensive. I ate a bowl of soup looking out at the Columbus skyline. And then I took out my phone and I called Alan Whitfield. He answered. It was after 9 o'clock at night, and he answered. I told him everything. He asked precise, careful questions. When I told him about the $40,000, the bank transfer, the lack of formal documentation, the equity review, Reginald had mentioned at dinner. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Mrs. Webb, do you still have those bank records?" I said yes. He said, "I'd like you to come in." What Alan Whitfield found when he began pulling on the threads of Bridgepoint's Solutions ownership history was, his word, irregular. The original articles of incorporation listed Caleb as sole founder. That was accurate at the time because I hadn't asked to be listed, but Alan found a paper trail that told a different story about the restructuring. When Reginald's attorney Hugh Garrett had formalized the equity structure 18 months earlier, they had documented the company's early funding sources. The $40,000 from me had been categorized, in Hugh Garrett's paperwork, as a personal gift, not an investment. There was a document in the file, signed by Caleb, that characterized the transfer this way. Alan showed me a copy. I looked at my son's signature. Then I looked at the date. The date on the document was 3 months after the Christmas dinner, where I had been seated at the far end of the table. 3 months after the caterers. 3 months after Daphne had quietly taken the plate from my hands. Alan said, "The issue is that characterizing it as a gift after the fact, without your knowledge or consent, and potentially in the context of a business restructuring that excluded you, could constitute fraudulent misrepresentation, especially given that there is documented evidence, the bank transfer itself, that this money was given at the time. Caleb was asking for startup capital, not as a casual family gift." He also found something else. In the original operating agreement of Bridgepoint Solutions, drafted hastily by Caleb before the Holbrooks became involved, there was a clause, standard boilerplate, that Caleb had apparently not understood, or perhaps not read carefully, that stated any individual who had provided more than $25,000 in startup capital prior to formal incorporation, and who had not signed a gift acknowledgement form at the time of transfer, retained a potential equity claim that had to be formally negotiated and released before restructuring. I had never signed a gift acknowledgement form, because it had never been a gift. Alan said, Reginald's attorney should have caught this, or he did catch it, and that is why this document appeared 3 months after that Christmas dinner. There was a formal shareholder meeting scheduled 6 weeks from that date. Bridgepoint was preparing to announce a partnership with a large regional logistics firm, a partnership that would significantly increase the company's value. The equity structure, Alan told me, needed to be fully clean and uncontested before that announcement could proceed, which meant they needed me to either not know or not act in time. I had called Alan Whitfield 2 weeks before the deadline. Alan sent a formal legal notice to Bridgepoint Solutions and to Hugh Garrett's office. The notice documented the original capital contribution, cited the operating agreement clause, outlined the basis for an equity claim, and requested an immediate meeting between parties before the shareholder announcement proceeded. I am told that Reginald Holbrook's face, when Hugh Garrett showed him the notice, was something worth seeing. I wasn't there for that part. But I was there for what came next. Caleb called me the morning after the notice was sent. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let it go again. The third time he called, I answered, because I am still his mother, and I could not keep not answering forever. He said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you just talk to me first?" I was quiet for a moment. Then as I said, "Caleb, I tried to talk to you. You told me I was embarrassing." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Reginald told me you were trying to interfere with the business, that you didn't understand how serious this stage was. He said, involving you would complicate the investor relationships. He said it would make me look like I didn't have a clean operation." I said, "And you believed him?" He said, "He's been right about everything else." I said, "He has been right about everything that benefited him, Caleb. That's not the same thing." Another silence. Then, "Mom, the 40,000. I always meant to pay you back. I was going to, once this deal closed." I said, "I believe you. I do. I don't think you intended any of this. I think you were guided into it by people who understood exactly what they were doing. And I think you trusted them more than you trusted me. And that's something we'll have to talk about when this is over. But right now there is a legal matter that needs to be resolved." He was crying. I could hear it. I said, "Caleb, I need you to tell me the truth about one thing. Did Hugh Garrett tell you what that document said? The one you signed? About it being a gift?" A long pause. He said, "He told me it was standard. He said it was just for tax purposes. He said it wouldn't affect anything." There it was. Alan Whitfield requested a formal meeting with all parties. It was held in a conference room at Alan's office, a plain room, nothing like the private dining rooms I had sat at the ends of. Reginald was there with Hugh Garrett and another attorney. Caleb was there, Daphne was there, and I was there with Alan beside me. Reginald looked at me the way he had looked at me at every gathering. Pleasantly, from a slight height, as if I were an obstacle he was already planning around. Alan laid out the case. The original transfer, the operating agreement clause, the document signed by Caleb, that mischaracterized the nature of the transfer without my knowledge, or a contemporaneous gift acknowledgement. The timeline that placed that document's creation directly in the period of restructuring activity, the potential legal exposure, not just for Bridgepoint but for Hugh Garrett personally, given his professional responsibility to ensure clean documentation. Reginald's smile did not change, but Hugh Garrett's did. Hugh Garrett knew exactly what he had done, and he knew that Alan Whitfield knew exactly what he had done. The negotiation took several weeks. I will not walk you through all of it because much of it was technical, and much of it was painful in ways I am still processing. What I will tell you is the outcome. My $40,000, which should have been documented as a startup investment from the beginning, was formalized retroactively as an equity contribution, given the company's current valuation and the growth that contribution had helped make possible. Alan negotiated a settlement figure that was significantly more than $40,000. I will not tell you the exact number because it is not what our story is about. What I will tell you is that it was enough to fix my roof. It was enough to restore what I had taken from my retirement account. It was enough that I will not have to worry about money in the way I worried about it. All those years when Caleb was small, and I was packing his lunch every morning at 5:30 before I drove to school. Hugh Garrett resigned from Reginald's retainer shortly afterward. I understand there was some conversation between Reginald and several of the Holbrook family's other business interests about what had nearly happened. And Caleb, I want to be honest with you about Caleb because I think you deserve honesty, and I think you probably know that real life is not as clean as a story should be. He called me the day after the settlement was signed. He asked if he could come see me. I said yes. He drove the 4 hours himself. No Daphne, no anyone. Just him in his car the way he used to drive home from college with a bag of laundry and a sheepish look. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table, the one we used to shake hands across. He looked like a man who had been asleep for a while, and had just woken up, and was still trying to understand what he had missed. He said, "I don't have an excuse." I said, "I know." He said, "I knew what Reginald thought of you. I knew he was steering me away from you. I told myself it was business, that I had to be practical, that you'd understand when it was all done and I could explain it properly." I said, "That is a very convenient thing to tell yourself." He said, "Yes." I looked at my son. He was 31 years old. He had built something genuinely remarkable. He had also allowed himself to be shaped, over several years, by a man who had looked at his mother and seen a liability, and he had not stopped it. He had not chosen me. Not when it counted. I said, "Caleb, I am your mother. I will always be your mother. But I need you to understand something. I am not just a role. I am a person. I worked hard my entire life. I gave you everything I had, and I gave it freely, and I would give it again. But I will not be invisible. I will not sit at the end of the table and pretend not to notice. I will not be categorized as a problem to be managed by a man who looked at what I sacrificed and saw something he could use." He nodded. He was crying again. He said, "Are we okay, Mom?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "We're not okay yet, but I think we could be." He stayed for dinner. I made soup. We talked for a long time. Not about the business. Not about Reginald. Just about ordinary things. The kinds of things we used to talk about before all of it. He asked me about the neighbors. I asked him about a television show he had mentioned liking. It was careful and fragile, and not at all like what we used to be, but it was something. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway for a long time. Long enough that I stopped counting. Reginald Holbrook still calls Caleb every week. I know that. I know Daphne is still his daughter. I know rebuilding what we were will take longer than one dinner at my kitchen table. I know that trust, once you have watched it fail, is not simply rebuilt by an apology in a familiar room. But I also know this. I called Alan Whitfield when I could have been quiet. I could have told myself I was too old to fight, too tired to explain, too afraid of losing Caleb entirely to risk making him uncomfortable. I could have sat at the end of every table for the rest of my life and smiled and convinced myself that proximity was the same as belonging. I was a 4th grade teacher for 27 years. I have spent most of my life explaining things to people who were still learning. I know that some lessons only land when they cost something. I hope my son learned this one's. I know I did.